Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sabine Marx. I'm the Managing Director at the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions here at Columbia University, and I have the honor to introduce the event and our speakers today. Today's event is the fourth in 6 events in the Research Without Borders series for the academic year 2010-2011. It is sponsored by the Scholarly Communication Program here at Columbia, the Department of Astronomy, and CESN, the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia University. I will introduce the speakers. Each of them will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll follow with a discussion. We'll hold questions until the end, until all speakers are done. We'll have a discussion, Q&A at the very end. We are videotaping this event, so questions from the audience, we're asking that you please step up to the mic in the aisle so that your question can be recorded and also heard by the entire audience. Our first speaker today will be David W. Hogg. He is an astronomer and physicist at New York University. His research is on observational cosmology, the study of the universe and its contents, with a concentration on galaxies like our own Milky Way. In addition to performing traditional scientific research, he works on engineering systems that can manage and analyze enormous data sets. And one of the spin-offs of this work is astrometry.net. A system that automatically calibrates amateur and hobbyist images of the sky for use in scientific astronomical investigations. It has calibrated tens of thousands of images on the photo sharing site Flickr and many more in other applications. His work is supported by NYU, NASA, and NSF, as well as the Humboldt Foundation. The second speaker today will be Rick Bonney, who is the Director of Program Development and Evaluation at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he has worked for nearly 30 years. He's the co-founder of the lab's Citizen Science program, and his research focuses on, first, developing projects in which the public actively engages in scientific investigation and environmental conservation, and secondly, understanding the social and educational impacts of public engagement in science. He's the founder and director of the website citizenscience.org, which is devoted to building and supporting the growing field of citizen science. And he advises numerous projects throughout North America that are developing exhibits, curricula, interactive websites, and community programs focused on science. He is the co-editor of a book, Citizen Science, scheduled to be published by Cornell University this year. And our third speaker today will be Jane Hunter, who is a professorial research fellow in the School of Information Technology and Electrical Engineering at the University of Queensland, Australia. She's also the director of eResearch Lab, where she leads a team of postdocs, PhD students, and software engineers developing software services for managing and analyzing scientific and research data. Her specific interests include the application of semantic web and social networking tools to the integration of distributed data sets for environmental monitoring and management. I would now like to invite David W. Hogg to the podium.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I am the person in the program who knows the least about citizen science, so it's good that I'm starting. I'm also going to try and define it, but before I define citizen science, I want to show you a few pretty pictures. So the photo sharing site Flickr, I don't know if you know the photo sharing site Flickr, but if you don't, I strongly recommend you check it out. It is not citizen science per se, it's citizen photography, where people upload photographs, and then the social networking aspect of Flickr brings the most interesting and most beautiful photographs to the top. And Flickr is the kind of site that makes you realize that citizen science is possible, because so much is possible on this site. So anyway, Flickr has millions of photos of all sorts of things, but in particular, if you search for astronomical objects, it's pretty good. There's galaxies here. Here's nebula. Actually, if you want to just explore great photos by amateurs, I suggest you search for nebula on Flickr, because there are such beautiful images of nebulae. But A strange search you can do is the search that's hard to pronounce, which is astrometry. And the reason you should search astrometry at some point is because if you click on an image, so I've clicked on a particular, it's very hard to see the images here on this screen. But here's an image that has been added to the group astrometry. So I don't know if you see this. It says the photo also appears in astrometry group. It's hard to see that at the edge. But if you take an image on Flickr, upload an image on Flickr, this is somebody who's taken a picture of the Milky Way from their backyard. You can just see it there. And then they added the image to the Flickr group called Astrometry. Okay, so now I'm going to pan down. And shortly after they added it to the group, a few seconds after they added it to the group, you can see a comment got added to the thing. It says here, astrometry.net. Hello, this is the blind astrometry solver. Your results are, and then it gives a whole bunch of numbers. And then it tells you that this image contains things like the NGC 6475, which is a globular cluster, and so on. So what we've built at NYU and University of Toronto is a system that can take arbitrary images of the sky and tell you where they are on the sky and what's in them. And the value of this, of course, is it makes images that are taken for fun into images that are potentially useful for scientific investigations. And then, of course, we play all sorts of games. For instance, our robot, this is all done by a robot, of course. And our robot also tags the image. You see it's labeled, that little thing is M7, which is a globular cluster. So now, if you go onto Flickr and search for M7, you can find all the images that our robot believes contains M7. And M7 is a very interesting object. It's a globular cluster that contains stars of great interest, including variable stars and phenomena that are accessible to backyard telescopes. One of the big sort of themes of the stuff I like to talk about is that the World Wide Web is effectively an amazing observatory. So people on the web take images of the sky all the time and put those images on the web. And they do that for a lot of different motivations. In fact, there's a lot of people on the web who are selling images. A lot of the people who post images on Flickr are selling images, selling nice prints of images, and they use Flickr as an advertising platform. What we did in this is a strange diagram, but what this diagram is a region of the sky. This is a plot of a region of the sky. And it's a region of the sky centered on Orion, which is a very famous, beautiful nebula that amateurs like to take photos of. In fact, there's 3,500, well, 2 years ago, there were 3,500 images on Flickr of the Orion Nebula. And what we did is we just asked, what do we see in those images? So the red circles here are cataloged stars, cataloged by professional astronomers in professional astrometric catalogs. And then the blue dots, of which there's millions of overlapping dots, are stars found in amateur images. And the punchline of this figure, if you're an astronomer, is there is a huge amount of information about the sky just in the pretty pictures that people have put on Flickr. And we could actually enlarge our knowledge of the sky just by mining the images on Flickr. This only is possible once you can calibrate them. So the fact that we could initially have our robot calibrate the images made this possible. If you were just handed a big sheaf of images of Orion, there's not very much you could do with them. You have to get them aligned on the sky and calibrated photometrically, which is what our robots do. Here's another example. There are enormous numbers of images of comets on the web. Comets are one of the things people most like to take pictures of, and some of them have become very, very bright. In fact, Comet Holmes, this is Comet Hyakutake, another comet we've looked at is Comet Holmes, which became so bright you could just take photos of it with a little point-and-shoot camera for a large part of its passage. Here what we've done is we've taken all the images on the web we can find of Comet Hyakutake and just aligned them and made a pastiche of them. And what you see is not one image of the comet, but thousands of images of the comet that all come up in a line. And because this line is very, very well constrained by the images, we can actually compute Comet Hyakutake's orbit from these images as accurately as it's currently known in NASA by the NASA JPL team, which tracks comets. So there's enough information on the web to reconstruct the orbits of solar system objects. Also, of course, This tracks changes in the comet. Hyakutake is not so interesting, but some of the comets change dramatically their appearance, and you can see the appearance change in composites like this. The one nice thing we've learned when we've done this, so to reconstruct the orbit, you actually need to know the times at which the images were taken. However, it turns out that, that not all times are possible with all orbits, and therefore we are able to take the images that are posted on the web and recalibrate the clocks in people's cameras. And we find that most people, in fact, do have the clocks on their digital cameras correctly set. That was surprising to us, but of course, astronomers tend to be nerdier photographers than average. But one of the amusing things that was a trouble for us is that the time setting on a digital camera does not include the time zone. So we had to infer the time zone of all the images. Now, some people are geotagging, but not everybody is. So there was an amusing sort of backstory here where we actually learned a lot about how photographers take photographs and what issues are with digital cameras. I'm going to come back to the point that camera times might not be set correctly going on. So I wanted to say what I thought citizen science was, since we're talking about citizen science. Most people in this room know a lot more about it than I do. I would say the most, and I've decided to define it by example. So here's the most minimal, I mean not minimal, it's a big project, but the thing that is sort of on one end of citizen science, it would be SETI at home. In SETI at home, there's a huge computationally expensive search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the way they do their data processing is by pushing their data out to people's computers at home. The computer does processing and sends back results. And that way they've farmed out their processing to many computers that are in just people's homes. So that is citizen science in the sense that the citizens bought the computers. But of course, more interesting things, intellectually interesting things, are things that use people's brain power and unique human capabilities to do science. And the next in the stage, if I sort of tried to stage them, I would say it was tagging images. So there's a project Galaxy Zoo in which people classify galaxies using human criteria, and then there's an attempt to understand the properties of galaxies from those human classifications. And Amazon has launched the Mechanical Turk to formalize this, where you can just buy time on large groups of citizens. And if you want to either use that or be employed by it, it's an amusing interface about which I can tell many jokes in the question period. Then there's projects, deeper projects where people actually take data for scientists, and I think some of those projects will be discussed next, where a scientist has a goal, and that goal requires a lot of data taking and you use people. So in the astronomy world, the most impressive thing is the AAVSO, the American Association of Variable Star Observers, in which they farm out interesting variable stars, and then astronomers, hobbyist astronomers around the world, take data on those variable stars, and then the AAVSO recollects that information and learns about the physical processes that are affecting these variable stars. There's also a microlensing community, which is another interesting one, but I don't have time to talk about it, called Microfun. Going on further, I actually think some Wikipedia entries could be thought of as citizen science. The description, for instance, of black holes on Wikipedia is one of the best descriptions that I've seen, and that was sort of a crowdsourced description. Of course, there are a lot of professionals contributing to that, but they're not the only contributors. Going further, sometimes web users produce scientific content on the web without knowing it. And of course, a lot of people in human sciences use the web as a data set, study social networks and so on. But it's also the case, as I just showed with my pictures of Orion and Comet Hyakutake, that actually web users are creating new scientific projects that they don't even know about by posting data that are rich. And then, of course, what I want to talk about, and what I think the long-term goal for this is to create platforms where hobbyists can initiate their own novel scientific investigations. And astrometry.net is definitely focused on that. But one thing I should mention is that amateur astronomers discover a lot of objects every year. A lot of the supernovae we know about, and a lot of the near-Earth asteroids we know about because amateurs found them. In fact, often they're school kids. And these, in general, are hobbyists who aren't working under the direction of a scientist. They've decided to take this on their own. And that to me is the most exciting thing, because that to me makes the most use of the unique capabilities of the people involved. Now I'll just say a bit of philosophy and then I will hand over the floor to Rick. One piece of philosophy is that all metadata are wrong. And this is an old quotation. In fact, it was about the semantic web. This quotation was first that I ever saw it. If you have data, and librarians, of course, think about this a lot. You have data. In general, the things that are written about the data tend to be wrong. When the data were taken, what it was taken with, what it's a picture of, how it's calibrated. There tend to be mistakes, in part because people who put data on the web don't really care about whether the metadata are correct. But as a scientist using data coming from other sources, especially from sources you know nothing about, like random IP addresses, you have to understand the metadata, when the data we're taking and what properties they have. And one solution to that, that's kind of the Galaxy Zoo and AAVSO solutions to that, is to have massive redundancy. Make sure every piece of data gets looked at by many people, and you look for consistency or lack of consistency in the results. And what we take, the attitude we've been taking at astrometry.net is to build robots that can vet the data directly. And that's where in fact, we started with this theme, not the citizen science theme when we were doing astrometry.net. That's the sense in which this is a spin-off of other work we're doing. Another philosophical point that I'm excited about, which I've already mentioned, is that good data takers might make good scientists. So it'd be good to give them a platform where they can initiate scientific projects. As I said, many discoveries are made by amateurs, and so amateur is not a bad word in astronomy. In fact, professionals will sometimes describe their research as amateur astronomy when they are doing particular kinds of activities. So for instance, amateurs are much better at taking images of the sky, beautiful images of the sky. So a professional astronomer who's taking images that need certain properties will say, I'm doing amateur astronomy here, and people will recognize that to mean a particular kind of very careful observing. So amateur is not a bad word in astronomy at all, and of course it means lover, or enthusiast, if you think about the word's root, and that's been kind of preserved in astronomy. So we would like to build a platform to capitalize on these capabilities and make it possible for hobbyists to actually generate their own scientific projects. And I'm kind of vaporware in the sense that we run on Flickr and we calibrate. Actually, we've calibrated millions of images now, tens of thousands in Flickr and millions in other domains. But we have yet to build this platform, so I'm not going to show you results. I'm just bringing up the philosophical points that make it exciting. Oh, by the way, I should mention that, and I forgot to mention when I was talking about the AAVSO, there's actually quite a bit of citizen science astronomy being done here at Columbia. Joe Patterson in the astronomy department works on variable sources with a large group of amateurs, very, very capable amateurs. By the way, you can't see this in its proper glory, and you won't be able to see the credit. Don McCready is the credit. He's one of the great amateurs on the web. And if you search, this is an image of the Pleiades, or Subaru in Japanese. And this is just the most beautiful. There's no professional image of the Pleiades that I know that shows this level of detail. And if you saw this with proper contrast, there's this great nebulosity around the stars. It's being illuminated by the stars. It's just an astounding image. Good, so I'm going to end by just saying what I think the challenges are for my vision of citizen science. So one really big issue is credit. We've built this catalog around the Orion Nebula. It's involved the contributions of literally thousands of observers, and the question is, how do we properly give them credit? I am already on papers with more than 500 authors, but the other authors are astronomers, professional astronomers. So it's an interesting question, what are we going to do about scientific credit? Not just because amateurs want it. In fact, many amateurs don't want the credit, but because it's the right thing to do from the point of view of scientific integrity. There's a repeatability issue, which is very related to the credit issue, which is how do you make sure that the sources of data are vettable and understandable and checkable. Data management issues are very big for us. So in many cases, the data in citizen science things are very small, but not for us. We want all the raw images that all the amateurs are taking, and that can be more than 1,000 gigabytes per person. So right now we're exploring cloud-based solutions to this, but we don't have a solution to this problem. That's one of the reasons we are not yet a platform for collaboration. It's a very hard problem. There's participation issues, which I think will come up again in the subsequent talks. What are the best ways to get people to participate with their full capabilities? And then finally, my interesting question is, can we get citizen scientists to work together, not just work on a project that is located somewhere else, but actually work in self-organized groups? I think if we can achieve that, the scientific capabilities of the world will grow substantially. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I'm not content with small questions. I like to take on big challenges, and I hope to show you in 20 minutes how I think that the concept of citizen science can actually be world-changing. As you heard in the introduction, come from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. A lot of people, there may be people here in the room who haven't even heard of us before, but we are in fact the largest department in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell, with about 250 staff and faculty and grad students and postdocs. I wish I had an hour to tell you about all the things we do there. I don't. But I would like to point out to you that we do have citizen science in our mission statement. Now, here's my definition of citizen science. I'm going to go ahead and read it, which is supposed to be a no-no with a slide. A project or activity in which the public collects and or analyzes data to help understand large-scale research questions. Now, I think I have some standing to define citizen science because I'm the first person to have used the term citizen science in this regard in the world. Back in 1995, we started using it at the Lab of Ornithology because we had been doing public data collection projects for many, many years, and we were concerned about the use of the word amateur. Yeah, it means lover, but it can be denigrating. So we wanted to come up with a new phrase, and we chose citizen science, and it has really taken off. Now, when I first wrote this definition in '95, it didn't say analyze data. It just said collects data. And I've since amended it to include the data analysis because what we do in the world of birds and at Cornell precedes the internet. Remember pre-internet? There's a world out there, and there still is beyond the internet, actually. And the kinds of projects that David was talking about, which are really based on analyzing images from the internet, are actually fairly new to the public data world. We do have such a project at Cornell, but I'm not even going to have time to talk about it today. I would like to point out that there is a rich tradition of citizen science. I don't have time to talk about all of these different early progenitors to what we do today, but just to point out that amateurs, volunteers, non-professionals have been informing the field of science forever. In fact, that's all there were once before there were places like Columbia and Cornell. Do notice the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, 1889, as being early on important. Probably I could demonstrate to you that the citizen science program at the Lab of Ornithology began in the year 1915 when we were formed. But probably really it became more formalized in 1965 when we started the Cornell Nest Record Card program, which simply involved people who were watching birds and finding their nests, contributing data on index cards, and we still have hundreds of thousands of these index cards in our files. But beginning in 1987 with Project Feeder Watch, which now has about 15,000 participants each year and produces about 100,000 checklists of birds each year. And then in the early 90s, the mid-90s, as the internet was developed, using the internet to test the idea that we could actually collect data over the internet with the Great Backyard Bird Count, we now get about 100,000 checklists in one weekend every February. We turned that Nest Record Card program into a project called Nest Watch, which has about 5,000 participants. eBird is a year-round global bird data collection project, and actually I need to update this slide because it's closer to 2 million checklists per month now. Celebrate Urban Birds is a year-round simplified version of eBird, and then Bird Sleuth is a formal middle school curriculum based on eBird. As you can imagine, each one of these topics or projects could be discussed for a full 20 minutes, if not an hour. I don't have time to do that, but what I wanted to show you was the breadth and the size of our program, and also to give credit to the National Science Foundation for having put probably at this point something approaching almost $20 million into this program of ours over the last 20 years. So when we talk about citizen science at the Lab of Ornithology, we're talking about two major goals that we have for all these projects. The first is to increase scientific knowledge and conservation action. So when we say that we have all these members of the public collecting data, why? Well, the simple answer is because we can't really understand or answer most questions about how the natural world works without hundreds or thousands or even millions of pieces of information, which are best gathered by the eyes and ears of the public. And then in a lot of projects, we want to use that information to apply it to science-based conservation efforts. The reason that I got interested in citizen science and the reason that the National Science Foundation has put so much money into my program is because we've always had the idea that if people are participating in the process of science, that they may become more scientifically literate. And by that, I don't mean just all birds have feathers, but there is a process by which data are collected and analyzed. And so when we say the scientific consensus is thus, that there's a process by which that knowledge was produced. My idea was if we can get people involved in this project, in these projects, then they may become much more literate scientifically. And I'm going to sort of come back to that in a minute or two and show you the information that we have to suggest that those things are happening. The citizen science projects that we work with basically are all about recruiting people into a project, whether it's bird watching or butterfly watching or even in some cases coral reef watching, and to learn the scientific protocols that scientists have set up to collect data accurately in a way that it can be compared across and among all users or data gatherers. Then gathering the data in groups, individuals, schools, homes, whatever it happens to be, following those protocols, submitting the data to a centralized database where it can be made available for analysis, and then finally, whether you're a professional or a member of one of these projects, visualizing the results from all of these databases and learning from them, learning things that you might have thought were interesting personally or something that you might want to try to publish. So some of the scientific results, or many of the scientific results that we have from bird watching projects have to do with range expansions. This particular slide here shows how the red-bellied woodpecker is expanding its range north very rapidly, almost certainly as a result of global warming or climate change. We have put many of our different projects to work for conservation. For example, one of our projects delineated where all of the cerulean warblers are to be located in New York so that we could begin to work with the government and the Nature Conservancy to expand protection for these birds and other birds that live in bottomland hardwood forests. And then, of course, the education results, and this I could talk about all day or even all weekend. The bird projects that we do, from the work that my group has done, which is surveys, focus groups, telephone surveys, pre and post tests, quizzes, and on and on and on. We know that people are learning a lot about bird biology, but they're also using our data analysis tools online to answer their own questions about bird diversity abundance, and they know that they're contributing to science. So over the last 10 years or so, there have been at least 50 articles published in at least 11 journals based on our data. And these include some pretty prestigious journals, all peer-reviewed, not only in the scientific findings, but also on the educational and social impacts of project participation. We were asked by the organizers of this to look at 4 different issues: data integrity, ownership of results, sustainability, and citizen scientists versus simply data collectors. So I'm going to with this very limited time, it's hard to really get deeply into all of these, but I want to touch on them all. And I want to point out that the kinds of programs that we do, and others that have been modeled on ours around the world, are really based on a very complicated program model. You don't just say, here's an idea, and you throw it out there and get people to collect data. But you have to actually go through a process of choosing a scientific question, developing a team, and that really should also have technologists and data analysts in it. developing and testing the protocols with people who are going to participate to make sure that they understand and that they're gathering accurate data. You've got to recruit the participants, which can be pretty hard. How do you get people to watch earthworms? It's easy to get people to watch birds. But there is a great earthworm project, a Great Lakes earthworm project, with a lot of people involved. You have to train the participants to be able to follow the protocols. You have to accept the data into a database and ensure data quality with a whole data management policy. You have to make those data available to the public and to professional scientists. You have to analyze and interpret the data so that they're not just sitting around uselessly. You have to publish and apply the results, or else really you haven't gone through the whole process of science. And then you need to measure the effects. You decide, is this really effective, and should we continue to do it? So again, I don't have time to go through this whole project model or program model in great detail. It's published in Bioscience magazine. I can give you the citation for anybody that's interested. But I wanted to talk just for a few minutes here about eBird, which is our biggest project. I can't do the math there. Talk about eBird and show you about some of these issues. So eBird started in 2003. I have a feeling that this slide's going to be hard to see. But it shows the rapid growth since 2003 in participating and collecting information about birds, not only from North America, but now all over the world, so that we're getting about 2 million observations per month into our database. And notice that line where it says eBird 2.0 launch, and how the curve begins to go up quickly after that. I'm not going to have time to discuss that now, but it might come up during questions and answers. And from this, we're able to really generate some pretty sophisticated maps here now, showing, for example, how the annual pattern of, say, the willow flycatcher is changing over time. And this is based on millions and millions and millions of records. You know, you can see, I'll let that run again. You can see that they first show up in migration actually in the Southwest, over in California, Arizona area, almost before they start to come back in the east. That wasn't actually even known before eBird. And then the real white hot spots show you where they're most common and when throughout the course of the year. We can do this for most species now. And the way that we're able to be certain about the quality of these data have to do, once again, with developing and testing the protocols, so that as we develop them, we make sure that the people who are going to collect the data understand them, and if they don't, we change them and get them to the point where they do know how to do them. In terms of the accepting data and ensuring the data quality, the forms that we use, the electronic forms, are smart forms. When you go to submit data for eBird, you submit a location, and you get a checklist for that location and for that time of year. And if you were to put in here an unusual bird, or try to put one in that wasn't on the checklist, or you put in a number which was beyond what was likely in terms of numbers of individuals, you would get an "Are you sure?" And if you say, "Yes, I'm sure," you'd get an email from one of our 500 regional editors all around North America who would want to query you further on that information before deciding whether to accept or deny that record. And then in terms of making the data available, data availability, well, all of our data are freely available. For one thing, we get a lot of National Science Foundation funding, so we're required to make it all available, but we would anyway, because these data are collected by the public and they should be available to the public. So you can go into eBird and you can view and explore data in a whole bunch of different ways. You can begin to see from this, there are bar charts, there are global range maps, there's even a Gulf spill bird tracker, which I won't have time to probably talk about unless it comes up in the Q&A, about how the National Science Foundation actually gave us money to expand eBird into looking for oiled birds right after the Gulf oil spill. They actually called us on a Saturday and said, if you can get us the proposal by Monday, we'll fund you to do this. And also, not only can you go into the database and generate all those graphs and charts and maps with, does anybody think this is funny, circles and arrows and a paragraph on the back of each one explaining what each one is to be used as? So some people here remember Washington Square. Okay. Anyway, all of the raw data are also available on the eBird reference data set at the Avian Knowledge Network. And anybody can publish anything they want and get it peer-reviewed if they want, and all we ask is that they credit eBird and the Avian Knowledge Network. Now, I think I'm running out of time. So coming back to the questions of sustainability and science identity, and talking about if citizen science can really help to save the world, well, that's when we have to really get into analyzing and using the data. This looks complicated. It's one of my favorite eBird results because it shows you at the Jamaica Bay National Wildlife Refuge how the height of use of the refuge by ducks and shorebirds is not at the same time, which might seem like, so what, unless you're the refuge manager trying to manage the refuge for both bird watchers and hunters. And with this data here, you begin to see you don't really have a problem. Right? You can draw the refuge down during the shorebird season and let the water back in for the duck hunters without antagonizing either group. The results have to be published, as I said, publications for participants like our newsletter BirdScope, but also in scientific journals and very importantly in popular articles so that the world understands the power of their neighbors to be gathering these data. The information has to be applied into conservation plans and reports to government agencies and management guidelines. In the figure on the right shows the tri-national vision for land bird conservation. That's Canada, US, and Mexico, which extensively uses all of our citizen science data in coming up with a management plan for all of the North and Central and South American birds. And then you also have to be able to measure the impacts in terms of knowledge, action, and literacy to be able to show the world that this is important and deserves further funding. I want to point out that the work that we're doing at the Lab of Ornithology is not being done in isolation. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of people really trying at this point to codify the field of citizen science. And this began with a conference that I and my colleagues organized at the Lab of Ornithology in 2007, funded by NSF. It was the Citizen Science Toolkit Conference, and it resulted in a proceedings, which is actually a whole lot of fun to read. It's very, very well edited by our conference documenter. But it also resulted in the website citizenscience.org, which is where you can find the Citizen Science Toolkit, which has all those steps that I showed before about all the different steps of project development. And each one of those steps has a great wealth of resources to help you be able to understand how to do all of those things when you're developing a project, including evaluation. We also have a lot of other resources on this site. There's a whole tab on here called Climate Change, which gets into all the work that, again, my colleagues and I are doing in using citizen science projects at science centers as ways of helping people to understand the local impacts of climate change. For example, we know through citizen science that birds are nesting as much as 20 days earlier than they did as few as 40 years ago, which has a huge impact on a species which has evolved over time to lay its eggs and raise its young at a time that when the most insects are available. And if because of climate change, those get out of sync, it's going to have devastating impacts on those creatures. So we have a whole section on using citizen science to discuss and teach about climate change, which I wish I had time to tell you. And as I said, it's got the steps of the toolkit. Now, coming back to this question about citizen data collectors versus citizen scientists, you can very quickly say, how are people really going to become scientists if all they're doing are collecting data, just like a bunch of graduate students? Well, a couple years ago, the National Science Foundation asked me to convene a group to actually do a white paper, a position paper on citizen science. And we ended up spending about 1.5 years doing this paper. And we actually called it not citizen science, but public participation in scientific research, which is a bigger umbrella term that includes citizen science, but some other things. So what do I mean by other things? When we stop and think about the steps in the scientific process, there, as all of you who are scientists know, a whole bunch of different things that you have to do from beginning to end to really get something understood and published. And in typical scientific investigation, it's scientists or technicians that do all the work. The question then is, with public participation, what do you want those public participants to do? And we realized when we started doing a meta-analysis, see, I can use the word meta. When we started doing a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of different projects that are out there based on an evaluation rubric that we created, we discovered that they sorted into 3 basic models. And citizen science basically is a contributory model where participants are collecting and maybe analyzing samples. But there are a lot of other projects that we labeled as collaborative projects in which the participants are working with scientists to do a whole lot more. They may be developing explanations for questions. They may be actually analyzing data. that they're collecting, not only data that have been collected by others. And then there's another whole category of projects called co-created projects, where the public are actually involved in the whole question from very beginning to end. A lot of these have to do with like pollution type projects, and they quickly move into a lot of social justice issues. So for example, the monarch larvae monitoring program, which is at the University of Minnesota, Karen Oberhauser and her colleagues used our report to get NSF funding to really begin to move her contributory project into a co-created one, where the participants in the project are not just collecting data, but they're beginning to ask and answer their own questions about butterflies in the process. Heidi Ballard, a colleague of mine from UC Davis, has done extensive work with people who are harvesting salal in the Pacific Northwest, and she took 25 mostly undocumented migrant workers who were harvesting this ornamental evergreen, and they developed a whole sustainability project from beginning to end to make sure that they were harvesting the salal in a way that would be there for them and their families in future generations. So the idea that you can work with the public to really do a project from beginning to end is very much there. So this is, I think, my last slide, and the Toolkit conference that we did in 2007 was really just the beginning. We're having a second Citizen Science NSF-sponsored conference at the American Museum of Natural History in April. In fact, I spent yesterday there working on the plans for that. There's a huge project called Data One, and that may come up in the next talk, or it might not, or maybe Q&A, but Data One is a huge NSF-funded initiative to try, the simplest way to understand it is to get all the biological databases in the world to begin to talk to one each other in an informed way. And so I'm the co-chair of the Citizen Science Working Group for Data One, trying to come up with best practices for data management needs to inform and work with the field of citizen science, and having a conference there pretty soon. www.citsci.org is a group out of Colorado State that has already developed a data agnostic or a taxon agnostic platform for invasive species projects. FieldScope at National Geographic just got $3 million from NSF to do a similar project. The Citizen Science Alliance brings together a lot of projects like the one that David spoke about in the last few minutes. ScienceForCitizens.net is a site that you can go to, which is not aimed, as ours is, citizenscience.org is aimed at the professional, but Science for Citizens is aimed at the amateur who wants to participate, to help them find one of the many hundreds of projects that are available. And then finally, we are now starting an association for citizen science, a professional association. Citizenscience.org will be its website, and over the next few months we're developing plans for an online open access journal for people who are involved in developing projects. And I don't know if I went over, I'm sorry if I did, but that's my spiel. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jane Hunter. I'm from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And you may have seen Brisbane on the news recently because we've been experiencing the effects of climate change on a first-hand basis. I think this year, the end of 2010, 2011, we've been impacted by floods, by cyclones, by bushfires. I was telling people last night we've had locust plagues and we're just expecting pestilence next. I'm not sure what we've done. So I'm from the University of Queensland, which is in Brisbane, and I run the e-research lab there. And I'm not a citizen scientist, but what my group does is we develop software services for scientists and for scientific data management. And we've become very aware recently that many of the groups that we're working with are going to be increasingly relying on citizen science data. So I can probably skip the definitions of citizen science, but what I think is important is, although Rick pointed out that it's been around since the 19th century, I think the advent of web-based technologies and mobile technologies is going to accelerate the adoption of citizen science by scientists and the involvement of the public in these programs. So I've got a number of points at the bottom here where the internet, social networking tools, increasing public awareness of climate change, the availability of technologies to capture data immediately from the field, and the requirement for large-scale longitudinal studies, both over time but over space, is going to require contributions across large communities because individual researchers can't generate that data on their own. And scientific groups as well can't generate the data. They need to rely on public participation. So often the data is used to complement scientific studies. So we've heard from Rick about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Avian Knowledge Network. There's also the Internet Bird Collection, which is similar to David's project, where the community uploads photos and videos and audio files. In summer, I've got a fellowship to work with the Nature Mapping Foundation, which is based at the University of Washington in Seattle, to help analyse their data. In Australia, we have the Atlas of Living Australia project, where I'm a CI on that project, and they're using citizen science contributions for monitoring changes in biodiversity. And then there's phenology projects such as Plant Watch, Project Budburst, and Citizen Weather Observer Program. A couple of other interesting citizen science projects, Foldit, which is an online game where people contribute to protein folding solutions. Galaxy Zoo, which David spoke about, where the general public help with classification of galaxies based on their shape. And in Australia, another project that we have, which is not in the area of environmental observations or biodiversity, but the National Library of Australia is engaging with the public to correct the results of OCR of digitised newspapers. And that's been very successful from their perspective. So, recently the Taxonomic Data Working Group had their annual meeting, TDWG, and they had a plenary session on citizen science. And they came up with a list of requirements that are common across many citizen science programs. Firstly, they identified that many scientists do not trust the data. So a common expression that you hear from scientists is wisdom of the masses is an oxymoron. Okay? So we have to try and overcome that. So the TDWG, who are a group of biodiversity data managers, identified that there's a desperate need for tools to improve the quality of data. So they want tools to, when we say quality, we're talking about the accuracy and precision of the data, the correctness of the data, the completeness of the data. Are there any gaps in it? Consistency in the data. And the timeliness of the data. Is it relevant? Is it recent? How recent is it? So they require tools to detect error and bias and remove the error and bias, to detect outliers, inconsistencies and gaps. And as David pointed out, one of the approaches to that, to detecting outliers and inconsistencies, is ensuring that you have duplicate data sets, or do you have a ground truth that you can compare against? So can you get multiple people contributing to the one data set and doing comparisons in order to get some statistical averaging? We want online taxonomies, simple tools for species identification, tools to measure the data reliability, online training services, and well-designed websites that attract and retain volunteers, that enable the generation of large sample sizes, duplicate samples, provide rewards and recognition to volunteers, and also provide volunteers with feedback on mistakes that they might be making in their data or the quality of their data. So the objectives of this project that we're running within the eResearch Lab are to, firstly, improve the quality and reliability of the data, and secondly, to actually measure the trust and reliability so that when scientists go to reuse the data, we can filter out unreliable or untrustworthy data. So to improve the quality, it's very important not to impact on the complexity of the tools, the data capture tools and the upload tools. So we're using, behind the scenes, controlled vocabularies and schemas. We're trying to automate as much as possible the data and metadata capture. We're ensuring that users are registered and authenticated. Previously, I'll give you an example, the case study that we're using is Coral Watch. If the contributors are anonymous, you're more likely to get unreliable data. So we use XML schemas to automatically validate the data on input. We're trying to identify the gaps and target volunteers towards those areas. We're doing comparisons of the data with ground truth data where available to check for consistency, or comparing duplicate data sets in the same area. And then the aim is to identify and remove erroneous data. Now, with regard to trust and reliability, we're looking at various methods, and I'm going to go into those in more detail. But we're going to use social networking tools where users rank each other and rank data sets, and then we can use inferencing across those networks to infer the reliability of a particular set across the network, and to filter the results based on that. So the technological framework that we're developing is aimed to match the platform that Rick described. So he's got a platform for establishing citizen science programs. So we're looking at what common software tools can we develop which would be applicable across a lot of these programs. So we're developing the validation and consistency checking methods. We're using tools such as Web 2.0, Twitter, smartphones for real-time data acquisition. We're using the trust metrics to filter out the unreliable and untrustworthy data, and we're developing actually tools such as collaborative tagging tools, visualization tools, and social network analysis and visualization technologies, overlaid on top of the underlying citizen science databases. So the case study I'll describe today is Coral Watch, and it's a citizen science project which aims to improve the information on coral bleaching events and coral bleaching trends in the context of the Great Barrier Reef, which is off the coast of Queensland. It's based at the University of Queensland, and it involves 1,300 volunteers from over 80 countries and over 30,000 surveys. So the amount of data that we have is nowhere near as great as eBird. So we're looking for other case studies to do more analysis and evaluation of our technologies. But it's an easy one to work with because they're local and they need help. So Coral Watch involves the use of these coral health charts, and it usually involves student volunteers, scuba diving groups or marine scientists who go out, and tourists on the Great Barrier Reef, who go out, they use these charts while they're snorkeling or scuba diving, and they follow reefs, transects along the reef, and they collect information about the colour of the coral by comparing it to this chart. So for example, staghorn corals are compared against E1 to E6. And if the colour's E1, it's highly bleached. If it's E6, it's very healthy. They collect this data, so there's actually a reef education package and there's a downloaded form. And in the past, they've downloaded the form, which is, they then have these, waterproof sheets that they can also put them inside. They snorkel along and they can tick off boxes. Someone collects those forms and then faxes them back to the coordinator at the University of Queensland. So we've been working on online data entry forms and the ability to upload Excel spreadsheets so that the coordinator at UQ doesn't have to collect all this paper and do it manually. So the actual data they collect and metadata, the contributors' details, the survey itself, the reef name, Latin long, date, time, the method they use, the water temperature, weather conditions, the location of the point or transect along the transect, the coral species, and then the bleaching or colour data. Now, they had an original system, version 1.0, which was based on manual input of the data from paper forms. So we've been developing these new online forms. We've developed a new metadata schema, which the input gets validated against. We've developed a PostgreSQL database. We've enabled user registration and user profiles, batch upload. We migrated all the legacy data across to the new database, and in the process, we analysed the errors and developed scripts to correct the errors and to identify where data was missing. So we developed data validation and verification services, user and survey ranking tools, trust computation services, and then the web-based search, browse, analysis and visualization services. So this shows the overall architecture. I probably won't go into too much details here. If anyone wants to, if there are any technical people and they want to know more, but it's all web-based. We use open layers, so you can use either Bing Maps, Google Earth, or Yahoo Maps for the visualization. We do that because Microsoft are funding the project, and so they want us to use Bing Maps, and yet a lot of our community users want to use Google Earth, so we support both. Okay. So analysing the Coral Watch data, and it was very interesting. And what we found was one of the most common problems was missing data. And the missing data was generally the latitude and longitude of the location. So without that, you'd think the data was fairly useless. But often they'll have the reef name there. And so we have a course location. Based on the reef name, we enter the reef name into a service, a web service called BioGeomancer, and that gives us the lat and long. Incorrect data. The most common problems were missing temperature. The temperature was in Fahrenheit, not centigrade, so it was the wrong units. The latitude and longitude might be transposed. The latitude and longitude might be negated. The coordinates are missing altogether, or they're outside the country range. So most of those we can correct easily by doing range checks. But invalid data as well. So the example I've shown here, the most common invalid data was the coral colour data would be wrong. So instead of putting E1 for bleaching and E6 for the dark colour, they would get them around the other way and put E6 for the bleaching and E1 for the healthy coral. And here's another example here. Someone's entered the data for Heron Island. They've got the time as midnight, but they've got full sunshine. So that's, clearly you can pick that up. And then the validation services. I won't go into that in too much detail, but this is just, again, a repetition of all the different tools that we've been using and developing to validate and verify the data on submission. Here's an example of the input form for creating a new survey. The usual sort of smart forms. It pulls it down and does comparisons and alerts the person who's contributing the data if there are any problems. If they have a GPS device, then they can enter the data directly. Otherwise, if they haven't got a GPS, it gives them a map location, and they can go to that map and get the GPS from that map. Actually, creating the survey where they input the colour coding and the type of coral. And then we undertook the data cleansing. And we found that by doing analysis of the data and verifying and validating it against our controlled vocabularies and our range checks, we were actually able to correct approximately 80% of the syntactic errors and the missing data, which was fantastic. The big problem we had is that we couldn't do semantic validation. There could still be wrong data there. And this is particularly difficult if there are no sources to compare the data with, or you haven't got any historical data. And this is where we decided to have a look at social trust metrics. And social trust algorithms are commonly used on the web in applications such as eBay. And there are different algorithms, Eigentrust, Advocado.org, and Film Trust. So we wanted to do an analysis of these different trust metric algorithms to see which one was the most relevant and could be optimised for the context of citizen science projects. So these recommender systems, usually used for recommending particular services or applications or products. For example, moving ratings, they're used in Amazon and they're used in eBay. And they generate a predictive trust between users, assuming that you can infer trust or that it's transitive across the network. So for example, if I rank someone I know, Peter, with 5 stars, Peter ranks Abdul with 3 stars. I don't know Abdul, but the system then assigns a trust between Jane and Abdul of 3 stars. And there's an algorithm such as this one here, which is the one used by Film Trust. So we're analysing these different algorithms at the moment. But there are other significant factors that we wanted to incorporate as well. So the contributor's role. Are they a scientist? Are they a government employee? Are they a student? Are they a teacher? Are they a volunteer? Are they a tourist? Within particular groups, age is very important. So in the K to 12 group, their age, whether they're in grade 3, 5, 7 or 9, the quality improves as they get older. The amount of training the contributor has undertaken, and whether that training has been online training or personal one-to-one training. Their experience. So, generally observers improve over time by approximately 5% improvement a year past the first year. So the frequency of contributions and the duration of contributions are important. And then also the quality of their past data. Can we compare their previous data with some ground truth data to detect the number of errors and incorporate that in their trust ranking? So what we've been looking at is how to calculate an accumulative trust value for a particular user based on their expertise, age range, training, frequency and duration, quality of past data, and a trust ranking assigned from other members if it's available. And how can you then calculate an aggregate trust? And we assign weightings to all those different attributes and come up with a value between 0 and 5 stars. So this person, for example, has 3 stars out of 5. So we have a person ranking tool here. I've logged in, I'm looking at a particular person, Bakar, and I can see my trust ranking. I've given him 4 stars, but the community has given him 3 stars. So the community trust is less than my value. Individuals can see the rankings that they give others, and they can see aggregate rankings that they've been given. They can't see the individual rankings that other people have given them because we don't want to deter contributors from coming back. We don't want them to turn into malicious contributors. We want to encourage them. So they can see their aggregate ranking but not the individuals. And then you can also have a look at the social trust graph, so how it's calculated. So here you can see the relationship between Charlie and Bakar, Charlie, Bakar, the administrator, and Charlie, Bakar, and then the other people that the administrator knows. So this shows the network that's being used to calculate the inferred trust. And finally, we've been developing these Google Earth and timeline interfaces, Bing Maps and timeline interfaces, for searching the data. So for example, someone's entered the query, show me all the coral watch observations for Masthead Reef between 2007 and 2009, but only those with the ranking of 2 or more stars. Well, I've actually shown you here the rankings of all of them from 1 star to 5 stars. So pink is 1 star, purple is 5 stars. So it's this filtering of data and presentation of data based on quality, which is the outcome that we're looking for. So where are we now? We're working on evaluation of the algorithms and the weightings and the methods for accumulating the trust values. How are we going to actually evaluate this? So we want to be able to have a look at the precision of the data sets before and after we apply this filtering of the data based on trust. So we need to have the ground truth data, and this is where we're looking at what data we've got at the moment and how we can overlay the two and compare the two. We also need to evaluate the performance and efficiency of the tools, their scalability and adaptability, their usability, and we need to undertake user feedback surveys with the stakeholders involved in the projects as well as the contributors. So this evaluation is some of what we're doing at the moment. We also want to, in particular, evaluate these tools in the context of other citizen science projects other than just Coral Watch, which is what we've been working on at the moment. So we've been talking to Birds Australia and Climate Watch Australia as well, and the Nature Mapping Foundation in Seattle at the University of Washington. So future work issues, which I think are very interesting. You can't assume that those trust metrics are static. They're going to change over time. So you're going to have to recalculate them, either because the individual, it's not necessarily going to get better all the time after duration. So individuals may actually get worse over time. I know myself, as I get older, the quality of my contributions may worsen. So periodic recalculation will be important, and how frequently would you have to do that? We've been developing the annotation tools for the data sets, and for the individuals we do need to do more work on that, because we're just tagging based on quality from the scientists who are involved, but we might also want to tag potential outlying data so people can go back and look at that more closely. The other area that I think is very interesting is how do you identify attacks by malicious contributors, and then how do you remove them? So at the moment, there's a time delay before the user has contributed a certain amount of data and before the community gets to know them, before you can identify malicious attacks. We'd like to reduce that latency. We're working on correlating the Coral Watch data, the observational data, with AIMS data, that's the Australian Institute of Marine Science. They actually have coral bleaching data from scientists generated through monitoring programs, but also they're deriving bleaching events, deriving it from MODIS satellite imagery that gives them sea surface temperatures, and there's a correlation between rising sea surface temperatures and bleaching events, but things like high nutrient levels or poor water quality are also relevant there. So can we use that as the ground truth for comparison? Statistical analysis of the data to identify gaps and target volunteers at those gaps in those data. It's interesting that most of the data that we get corresponds to Heron Island, Brampton Island, what else? Where the major tourist sites are. Okay, so it's like, I like to ask Rick if they get large the frequency of observations correlates with where the population happens to be. So how do you remove that bias from the data? We want to evaluate the existing tools in the context of other projects, and then finally we need to do more work. We've started working on this. We have a project, a PhD student working on this, but it's the smartphone and iPad interfaces to enable data capture in the field, online species identification keys, and notifications to subscribed users when they enter a place where there are citizen science programs going on, and to let them know what citizen science projects and what data needs to be captured in that area. So to conclude, as Rick said and as David said, citizen science is exploding, but across many disciplines. I believe there are many common challenges. There is a critical need for automatic techniques to improve the quality and trust of the data. I think you need to combine data quality enhancement and social trust metrics to improve the reliability, and essential component are the analysis and visualization tools. And I'd like to acknowledge Abdul Alabri, who's a PhD student working on this, Diana Klein and the Coral Watch community who we've been working with, Microsoft Research, and there's my contact details and some websites on the projects if you need more information. Thank you.
I would like to invite the speakers to the table in the front for the next part of this session, which is the Q&A.
Hello, it was very, very interesting to hear all these talks. So you mentioned, Jane, you mentioned something in your talk that actually kind of puzzled me. So you said that there was a difference between where the training came from, if it was online or in person. So what was that difference, and why do you think that is?
Is this on? It is on? Okay. Well, this is not actually research that we've done. It was in a paper which I read, and I can't remember who it was that identified this. But what they found was that if it's person-to-person training, so for example, in Coral Watch, when it's tourists who are with a particular dive group, then they usually have someone with them in the dive group who shows them the protocol, teaches them the protocol for collecting the data and explains it to them, and then helps them as they go along while they're collecting the data. So that's person-to-person training. Online training is where they just, perhaps it's an online test, they have to read some documents, and then they might have to undergo a test to check that they've understood the scientific protocol for collecting the data. And I'll see if I can find the paper for you, but what they identified was that generally the people who've undergone personal training with, a teacher collected better quality data than just undergoing online training.
We have some research about that too from our NestWatch project, because in the NestWatch project you can either go online and read all the protocols and take a quiz, which we encourage people to do before they submit their data. But we also, for a while, had a lot of regional training programs going on at nature centers, and we did not find a difference. In fact, we found that the people who were participating in the hands-on, face-to-face training were less likely to submit data than the people who came online. And we think it's because the fact that they were in these workshops is because they were less confident to begin with. So you really have to understand a lot about the motivations and the aspirations and the knowledge of the participants before they even enter training to be sure about your outcomes there. It's very complicated.
I'll see if I can find the paper for you and give you a copy.
Hi, another question for Jane. After you implemented your star rating, have you seen any effects of users reacting to their rating? Have people that got bad ratings started getting better?
Okay. At this stage, we've mainly been working just with the Coral Watch people themselves who are involved, because they wanted, before we put this out in the public with all of their public contributors, they wanted to understand precisely how it worked. So we're just working with the Coral Watch people themselves, because they're scared that this approach will scare off their contributors. So we're undergoing testing in the next few months with a small group of volunteers to just understand the response of the volunteers themselves to this system.
One thing that's really, really noticeable is that in sort of Web 2.0 websites where people share images and video and so on, there are very big differences in the nature of the sort of inter-member communication. So my joke about this is that on Flickr, people are very, very supportive of one another and try to comment in ways that are very constructive and positive. And on YouTube, people just insult each other openly at the opening. And to me, it's really, there's just a huge difference, and I don't think the issues about how that appears are really understood, these differences in culture, response to commenting and so on.
It's interesting because in some situations, some applications, the ranking works really well to make people more competitive, so they want to contribute, so they want to improve their ranking. In other systems, that kind of ranking is kept hidden, and it's only used, behind the system to filter out data. So this is where we need to identify what's the best approach for which particular citizen science projects. It may vary across them.
Yeah, and we have the same thing going on in eBird. In eBird, the participants don't actually have the opportunity to know who the other participants are. They don't talk to each other. We have rankings, but you don't know your ranking. The public doesn't know. We know behind the scenes a lot about the quality from individuals. But to complicate this again, I want to bring in motivations to participate in the projects in the first place. So for a very long time, we thought everybody's going to want to be a scientist. And we actually had some pro bono work done many years ago by a huge advertising company, Ogilvy Mather, and they came up with a great advertising campaign that was "Lend your brain to science." Well, not all of it, just the part that counts birds. And it didn't work. And I'm glad it was pro bono, because it would have cost me a lot of money for that failed experiment. When we started eBird, it was the same thing, count birds for science. Well, you remember that graph I showed, and I said pay attention to that line where it really started to go up when we introduced eBird 2.0. What we did there was we gave up trying to get people to count birds for science, and what we said was manage your online life list for free. And up until that point, you had to spend a lot of money to get software that would do this. But now, if you go into eBird, you can put all your birds in there. There's a lot of different ways that you can put them in, a lot of different protocols. You showed us a lot of detail about Coral Watch, which I didn't have time to do with eBird, but there's traveling counts and stationary counts, and there's just a lot of ways to put your information in there. You can do it from your home, your office, your vacation spot, and you can manage all of those different life lists. You can go in there and say, okay, when did I see my first bluebird at the Maine cottage in 2003? And it's going to tell you, and it's all free. So right now, I would I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure that most people are using eBird just to manage their data, and the benefit is that we get that information. Now, do we want to rate them? Do we want to rate, there's just so much more work that has to go on here. I would add one other thing, though, which is that in last year's evaluations of our Great Backyard Bird Count, we did a whole lot of quizzing for the first time. We did some pretty sophisticated quizzes of bird identification skill. And one of the things and we also asked people to self-rate themselves in a different part of the survey. And we discovered an astonishing correlation between people's self-rating and their answers on those skills. So people in the birdwatching world do know how good they are, with the one caveat that women underestimate themselves consistently.
Okay, maybe we need to add self-ranking.
Actually, it's very interesting, the point about providing a service, because we find also that the only real way to obtain full imaging data sets from astronomers is to work with a site that they're using to display their full imaging data sets. And so I think it really is a beautiful idea if the citizen science can capture something that's of great value to the people for their hobbies. I think that's a great idea.
In a way, perhaps this is a follow-on. I'm wondering, do you have any information or data on the extent to which the participation in complementary projects is competitive or complementary? In other words, are the people engaged in one project likely to be engaged in an independent project as well because they're interested in the same field, or do they tend to cluster around a project that they know? Do the astrometry net people also take part in Galaxy Zoo, or are they independent communities?
Actually, I noticed that Rick showed an image of somebody using a telescope to image birds. That is a great question to which I don't know the answer at all, but I can say something irrelevant on the side of it, which is that just if I look at people I know who are great amateur astronomers, they also tend to be very outdoorsy. They're often also bird watchers. They have an interest in all sorts of scientific subjects. So I feel very confident that there are correlations, strong correlations. And Jane said something very interesting about the idea of having your mobile phone said, hey, you're in a location where we need more X. And I bet there are people out there who are interested in a wide range of things and would participate. So great.
But my data don't support you, because we do lots and lots of user surveys of all of our different projects, and we always ask Great Backyard Bird Count participants, eBird, Nestwatch, we always say, are you involved in these other citizen science projects? And we give all kinds of options. I think we've even asked about reef, which is not the same thing as coral watch. It's not about bleaching, it's about reef fish populations. And we've asked about Galaxy Zoo, and we don't see the overlap. You're doing the bird projects or you're not. And a lot of times when people ask me for help in trying to conceive or write, especially NSF projects, and they've got this taxon that they want to study, I really shake my head and I say, how many people really want to go out and study segmented worms? And I think when you're working with something that's already a hobby, you've definitely got a leg up. That's not to say that it can't be done and we shouldn't try, but it's going to be hard.
But yeah, I agree. And that relates to the other point about providing back services that are valuable to the people, is that you really want to capture things. And we're in a lucky space where we work on subjects that lots of ordinary people think are cool. But it's much harder in areas that are more esoteric or less beautiful.
So a study could be done on that by working with the website that I showed you. I showed you the URL anyway. It's scienceforcitizens.net, which is actually a for-profit website. I don't think they've made any profit yet. I think they aspire to. But it's an awesome opportunity to really speak to the public as aspiring citizen scientists. And it would be really a lot of fun to work with that group and do some studies about people's willingness to participate in a variety of projects. Because that website would be where you'd get the audience to study.
Yeah, I think the other it is an issue in Australia. There's Reef Check and there's Coral Watch, and you mentioned reef. There's also projects for capturing data about manta rays, about dugongs, about turtles. So how does someone choose? And usually they choose because the organisation or group they belong to has been approached by someone. So, for example, many of the fishing trawlers off the east coast of Australia, the fishing organisations and individual fishermen are approached for capturing information about whales or dugongs. So it is a case of whoever approaches them first. So the schools in Townsville are approached to take school kids out to the reef to collect data. And if they're approached by Reef Check first, they'll go with Reef Check. If they're approached by Coral Watch first. But you're also assuming that the tools and technologies are simple enough that it's not onerous for them to do this as part of either the school curriculum or as part of, when they're undertaking fishing.
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting point that relates to things that all three of us spoke about, is that all three of us aspire to have systems that are general purpose, and that might make the environment less competitive in the sense of permitting people to participate in multiple systems sort of easily or transparently. It's interesting.
We have that problem even at the Lab of Ornithology. So you're a bird watcher and you go to our website and do I want to do eBird or Feeder Watch or Celebrate Urban Birds? Or what's the difference among all these projects anyway? And one of the things that we're building now, it's not a project I know a lot about. It is a Cornell Lab of Ornithology project. It's called Yard Map. And it starts out by actually using online software to map your yard, where are the shrubs and the ponds and the trees. And so obviously it's probably not going to be terrific in the Upper West Side. But at least for the people who have a yard to map, what it is then going to do is get them to start reporting the birds that are in their yard, and they're not going to have to worry about which project they're in. And in fact, something that most people don't really know or understand about our projects is that they actually all talk to each other. If you put your data into eBird, well, it's just one big database, and these different projects are almost marketing applications to different audiences.
I have a different type of question. When you start out just getting people involved, they're not really the subjects of your research, but obviously as soon as you start evaluating them and going in, groups like institutions like NSF and universities like Columbia will, require you to abide by human subjects regs and so forth. So I'm just curious as to what your experience has been. Has that been a barrier? Has it been an issue moving into the fact that you are dealing with people and affecting their lives and evaluating? And I don't know if that is an issue with you in Australia, Jane.
It is an issue, but not for me. So Diana Klein, who runs the Coral Watch project, it's an issue for her. So when the people sign up to contribute, they also sign some kind of agreement to release the data. I don't know that there's any ethics involved in the Coral Watch, but they definitely sign an agreement to make the data available. But from my perspective, it's not an issue, but we could help with having online data agreements and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we do have to get IRB approval for all of our evaluation work, but thus far it's all been exempt. I've had to get letters that show that it's exempt. But for those of you who deal with IRB, I don't remember the wording, but there's a clause in there that says something about if this project can be thought of as simply an educational project where you're involving people in learning, then it's exempt, because we're not actually manipulating the people. We're not actually experimenting with the people.
Yeah, but clearly at some point, some of the questions we'd like to answer will cross that line.
And then we'll get IRB.
It's exciting.
Also, I think establishing personal profiles for individuals who are involved, then you're starting to get into the issues of personal privacy and personal data. And yet that information is very valuable, both for providing relevant training and other information, but also when they're doing searches and queries, so for personalising and customising these search and query results. So I think there's a lot that can be done there, but there are also the personal privacy issues that need to be considered.
I have two questions. One appears very interesting for the validation of the data collected by the amateurs. Jane mentioned one possible methodology using satellite image, like MODIS. You mentioned that. I don't know. I wonder if you have more to explain the ideas. Second one is very interesting. When I was 40 some years ago, when I was a kid, and I often heard the term popular science for the difference of the classical science. So recently I heard the term of the citizen science, and I don't know, wonder anyone has tracked the term historically. Thank you.
So I'll respond to the first part of the question, and I'll let you two respond to the second. So the coral reef scientists that we're working with, they're interested in the impact of climate change on coral reef ecosystems, and in particular, the correlation between climate change and frequency of bleaching events. And what's the cause of bleaching events, and is there anything that can be done to mitigate the effects of bleaching? Now, in order to do that, they have determined that a number of factors cause coral bleaching. One of them is rising sea surface temperatures. So when the sea surface temperature goes above, I don't know, it might be 22 degrees centigrade, then there's much more likelihood of bleaching. But it's not just sea surface temperature, it's also the water quality. So if there's high turbidity or high nutrients, so when we have high rainfall events in Queensland, such as we've had recently, then you're getting a lot of the soil and a lot of the pesticides from cane farming and other types of farming, and a lot of nutrients from human sewage washed into the rivers. They washed out into the bays and onto the reef. That also has a big impact. But with the MODIS satellite imagery, they can analyse that imagery to derive sea surface temperature results. Okay? And so if there's a correlation between sea surface temperature when it goes above 22 degrees centigrade, and you've also got high turbidity in the water, then you're more likely to get bleaching. So then we want to overlay the actual Coral Watch data with the satellite imagery, and but only the satellite imagery for the particular period when the sea surface temperature goes above 22 degrees and you've got high nutrients and sediment in the water. So using that kind of overlay of data to look for correlations and detect outliers as well.
So on that point, one of the most interesting things about amateur astronomy is the ability to detect anomalies. And both of you two mentioned the fact that you look for outliers, and outliers are suspect. And of course, even in astronomical data, almost all outliers are suspect. But occasionally an outlier is of enormous interest, and sometimes it's more interesting than all of the inliers. And there's several coupled issues here. One is that you often have layers of other data, like satellite data. Sometimes, and of course you specifically mentioned that there can be inconsistencies in the way people fill out forms, which allow you to identify things. But you definitely want to be open to finding outliers and investigating them. And I know one place where that came up is Galaxy Zoo. And one of the things they did is they kept a sort of open-ended forum for people to just discuss outliers. And then that open-ended forum actually led to some of the most important discoveries in the project were these outliers. But I do think when the number of records gets enormous, like you're facing, it's very hard to see like automated and robust ways you can find the interesting outliers.
So there was also the question about popular science.
Mm-hmm. That's a hard one.
Both of you mentioned the definition of the citizen science.
Right, I'm not sure if I really understood the second part of the question.
Well, you were asking about the term popular science, right? What happened to that term? I think not. I mean, I think of popular science as being the science that's accessible to the public in a certain way. And of course, a lot of what people in this room do is try to make science more accessible to the public. And I think citizen science much more implies a participation, direct participation, and not just at the understanding level. But I certainly know nothing about the anthropology of the terms, as it were.
Right, when we were working on the report for NSF, where we were trying to define the field of citizen science, we ran into so many different terms. There's community science and civic science, and we hadn't even thought about popular science, but participatory research, participatory action research, and others that I'm forgetting. And that's why we went out on a limb and came up with our new term, public participation in scientific research, to encompass all of those. And that's why we came up with those three new categories with boring titles, contributory and collaborative, because we were trying to get away. We didn't want to try to redefine any of those other ones that had already been used. Now, we're working on a paper right now that presents 5 models rather than 3. And one of those is the DIY, whatever, the do-it-yourself, the folks that are in their basements inventing amazing stuff. And to me, those were the people that subscribed to popular science and really did a lot of important work, and still are. And there's actually a society that speaks for those folks, or to those folks. It's the Society of Amateur Scientists, SAS. They have a great online journal and a lot of information for people that still want to invent time travel in their basement or whatever. And one of them probably will. I hope that sort of answers the question.
This may be more of an observation than a question, but it might lead to further discussion of this. I had recently come from a conference on citizen journalists and citizen journalism, and there was clearly a deliberate choice of the term there to articulate a view of the role of the individual in relation to society, that the citizen is an active member of society and contributes in constructive ways and so forth. And I actually thought that might be part of what the term citizen scientist was trying to get at, an encouragement of that, and might change the whole nature of what it means to be a citizen.
Well, so I'm 99.9% certain that I can lay claim to having started the use of this term. And I was writing a grant proposal to NSF, it was 1995, and I said, I don't want to call them volunteers because some of them are paying us, and I don't want to call them amateurs because it can be denigrating. What the heck are we going to call folks anymore? And I said, how about citizen scientist? And then I thought, does that sound too much like Citizen Kane? And I thought, whatever. And I wrote it down, and kind of the rest is history. Now, Alan Irwin published a book in 1995 in the UK called Citizen Science that same year, and he was using the term to talk more about civic or contributing to social policy, which is a very important field, and he still works in that area. So there really was not a lot of deliberation on my part to using the word. And I don't know how much deliberation there was on anybody else's part, like the National Audubon Society or the National Wildlife Federation that just grabbed onto it. Now, just this last semester, I co-taught a graduate seminar in public engagement in science with Bruce Lewinstein at Cornell, who's probably a familiar name to some of you. And we spent 2 weeks studying citizenship, which I'd never done before. We read all kinds of papers on citizenship, and the question was, was it a good idea that I, or if it wasn't me, whoever came up with this? And also, I should point out that at the 2007 conference, there were a lot of people in the room who were upset with the term citizen science because a lot of people are afraid of the word citizen. And right now, there's a lot of talk about immigration, so there's a lot of interesting connotations with the word right now. And again, that's why we got away from using it in our report and switched over to the PPSR. But what I decided at first during this graduate seminar, listening to graduate students who knew way more than I did about citizenship theory, listening to them, I first thought, no, I wish I hadn't. And, you know, it was really civilian science is really what we were talking about, non-professional. But then, the more I thought about it, I decided that what's really important to think about is the citizenship of science. And the obligation that science as an institute or institution, globally speaking, has to the world to be transparent and inclusive and try to make what we do something that not only can anybody understand but can also participate in. So now I'm glad I did it, although I still think that people will debate it forever. And I'll just add one little funny story, is that I sat in another seminar once listening to people debate what the person who came up with the term meant. But I wasn't, my presence wasn't known in the room. And that was really, really funny. It was like Mark Twain, you know, was it Tom Sawyer at his own funeral? Or else all these people that try to figure out what Bob Dylan was talking about in any of his songs, and he'll answer you, hell if I know.
I like the implication, though, of the journalism, citizen journalist thing, where I do think both the idea that science has a responsibility to the citizens, but also that part of citizenship, especially as we're entering a phase in which the public has a lot of influence over the world now with global warming and so on, that citizenship does involve some kind of scientific responsibility, I think.
I think a good term to describe it is the democratization of science, which is being enabled through these citizen science projects. And I'd also like to say that the term citizen science, it isn't so well accepted in Australia. The term citizen has American connotations to it. So I prefer public participation in research programs. That was what your new title is? Yeah.
Great.
That has a better, it would be better accepted in Australia, I think.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. Now, democratization of science, I grabbed onto that early on when I first heard it. I think that comes, a lot of that comes out of the UK. But I quickly discovered, I mean, at the Lab of Ornithology, where I am a social scientist, most of my colleagues there are real ornithologists. And I discovered that the democratization of science was, what's the word I'm looking for here? They were worried about that. It was threatening. It was threatening to them to hear that term.
Right.
So, because they had spent their whole life getting a PhD and studying, and they didn't want that democratized.
We will offer co-authorship to everybody who contributed data. Now that's probably not sustainable for a lot of projects, and a lot of projects don't have that tradition in the field. But I think. But, you know, the other thing I should say is that in astronomy and in physics, author lists of more than 2,000 people are now common. In fact, there are many papers now in the physics literature in which the author list is longer than the body of the paper. And so for us, it's much less of a problem because we've kind of faced that issue. But if we got to 100,000 participants, you know, I don't think anybody has a real model for that except, you know, credit by reference. But I don't know if you guys have thought about that.
I know that the researchers I work with in environmental sciences, the marine scientists, if they're reusing this data, they will credit the Coral Watch organisation, but not individuals. But there are initiatives around, quite a few, and they're they're making significant progress in standards for data citation. So then you can have citations to particular data by individuals contributed through citizen science projects, and those citations would be within publications. So I think that these methods will enable specific citation of individual contributions of data through these projects.
Yeah, actually, that's a very generic problem in all of the sciences now that use heterogeneous data, is that how you refer back to the data. There's another issue which is related, which is this repeatability issue, that in astronomy we're trying to build systems so that if somebody wants to repeat the analysis in a paper, they can. And that requires not just citation of the data, but kind of deep links.
The detailed provenance. So,
Right.
for example, if someone analyses all of the Coral Watch data and then they generate a graph which shows the trends in bleaching events, you need to know what data they've used to generate those trends, what kind of statistical analysis they've used to generate the graph. And so there's also significant work going on the capturing the detailed provenance of the derived data from the citizen science data.
Right, and there's issues there of the data evolving under you. So there's you want to be able to roll back the data. A referee might want to roll back the data and see what the data looked like at the time that this analysis was performed. And there's technical issues there that are not entirely trivial.
If there are no more questions from the audience, I will use my moderator privilege and to ask one question. And that there appears to be two dimensions to citizen science, and one seems to be more prominent in our discussion here, and that's the how do we get data that already exists, that citizens collect, how can we integrate it into our projects and engage with them. And then there's the educational part, educating the citizen participants on the work that they're already doing, and to learn more from the scientists. And then I see as a sub-dimension of that second dimension, how can you engage people who are not already bird watchers or who are not diving and not already interested in this in the science? How do you engage them? And I think with particular look towards climate change, which David mentioned, there's a certain responsibility as to what we as scientists know, and there's a response that citizens need to take. So several of you work on climate change related projects, as Jane and Rick mentioned that. How do you get to people who are not already engaged, and how can you use your citizen science, the tools, to get more people involved and to respond to the scientific information that is produced?
Well, since I'm not named, I have a comment on that. One thing is that we were discussing last night over dinner. We were discussing unschooling, the idea that people should learn what they're interested in rather than what school pushes on them, and that we were talking about that a little bit. And in that model, citizen science is best done by people who are already excited at some level about the subjects. But I agree, actually, that one of the goals of these projects is to actually create new astronomers, new bird watchers, new divers, and with a deeper understanding of what they're doing. And I think, first of all, I think it's a hard problem. But second of all, I think one thing that's definitely happening in education, this is now schooling, not unschooling, education in America at least, is there's a lot of emphasis on, and I think quite rightly, on students performing their own research-like activities and then evolving to doing true research activities. And I think that whole mode of learning is kind of searching for outlets, but these citizen science projects produce incredible opportunities to give students in school or unschooled students a way to learn about research. So somehow I feel like it's connected to childhood and education.
Well, I have so many responses to that question. Okay, so the first one is, I have no idea, and if you can figure it out, if I knew, we'd have a lot more people in our projects. Another response is a little bit like where David started here, which was, give me a break. Look what we're doing already, and now you want me to get more people involved? We already have thousands and thousands of people who are finding something meaningful and important to do with their hobby and to feel empowered in society, and now you want me to reach out? And I say that partly tongue-in-cheek and partly out of exhaustion, especially from NSF with the underserved audience. I've been, for 25 years, been trying to figure this out. Now, that said, we are trying really hard. In our Celebrate Urban Birds project, for example, the simplified version of eBird is designed to bring Latino or Hispanic, depending on where you are, audiences into eBird and citizen science through the performing arts and through other arts and cultural ways of appealing to the family structure. And we've done a lot of work with that right here in New York City with bird festivals, and they almost get tricked into recording some of their data. Now, I don't have enough long-term data to know what kind of longevity or retention we have there yet. And then also, what David said, we do have curricula that work in middle schools, and in those cases, the kids don't really have an option. If the teacher says you're going to do this, then they do it, and some of them do find out that they are interested and get hooked. And we have some anecdotes about kids who have gotten hooked that would make you just cry, huge tears. You know, if you heard about some of the kids who stopped going to recess and went to shop to build birdhouses to give to their families for Christmas. You know, well, it's a handful, but it keeps us going.
I think people are keen to leave, but I'll just quickly say, I think get them when they're young, which is what the other two have said. Rewards and recognition. So the one where students will fail if they don't do this work, as if it's part of the curriculum, but rewards as a marketing tool on the website, so the people who are the best contributors go to the top of the list. Some projects give them gifts if they reach the top of the list. So they get cups, they get t-shirts. Someone suggested free beer, but that's rather hard to deliver on. And especially if they're underage, you might get into trouble. And recognition, again, through the website. So rewards and recognition are very important, I think.
I think this concludes our session today. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you to a great audience with great questions. And
thank you to Catherine Pope for
bringing us
organizing
here very
this.
much
Yes.
so.
Thank you. And thank you to the